The sun was setting on Pine Valley Road, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. Officer Richard Wilson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched cars pass by. He'd been having a rough week. 3 domestic disturbance calls, a shoplifting case that went nowhere, and endless paperwork that seemed to multiply every time he looked away. The clock on his dashboard read 6:45 p.m. when a black Range Rover with slightly tinted windows caught his attention. The car was pristine, probably worth more than his yearly salary, and something about it made his jaw tighten. The driver appeared to be a well-dressed black man, and Wilson's eyes narrowed as he watched the vehicle pass. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered to himself, pulling out from his spot and falling in behind the Range Rover. The SUV was moving exactly at the speed limit, maintaining perfect distance from other vehicles and using turn signals well in advance. But Wilson kept following, his eyes fixed on the vehicle like a hawk tracking its prey. Inside the Range Rover, Special Agent David Carter noticed the patrol car in his rearview mirror. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was being tailed. With 15 years of FBI experience under his belt and a recent promotion to lead the local field office, he was all too familiar with situations like this. Still, his heart rate picked up slightly, not from fear, but from a tired frustration he knew too well. Carter did everything by the book. He kept his speed steady, maintained his lane, and made sure his driving was beyond reproach. But the patrol car stayed with him, turn after turn, mile after mile. He was just heading home after a long day of briefings and meetings, his suit jacket hung neatly in the back seat, his FBI badge securely in his breast pocket. "Here we go again," Carter thought to himself as the red and blue lights finally flickered to life behind him. He'd been expecting it, but that didn't make it any less disappointing. He carefully pulled over to the side of the road, positioning his vehicle perfectly parallel to the curb. His movements were deliberate as he turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and waited. Through his side mirror, Carter watched Officer Wilson approach, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. The officer's body language was tense, aggressive even, despite the complete lack of threat. Carter took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He'd been on both sides of law enforcement and knew how these situations could escalate if handled poorly. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, but the beauty of the evening was lost on both men as they prepared for an encounter that would change both their lives forever. Neither of them knew it yet, but this routine traffic stop was about to spark a chain of events that would shake the department to its core and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, prejudice, and the power of accountability. As Officer Wilson's boots crunched on the gravel, getting closer to the driver's side window, Carter silently activated his phone's recording function and placed it on the passenger seat. Years of experience had taught him to document everything, and something in his gut told him this interaction would need to be preserved. The neighborhood around them was peaceful, kids riding bikes in the distance, people walking their dogs, and porch lights starting to flicker on as dusk settled in. It was the kind of community where everyone felt safe, or at least almost everyone. As Wilson's shadow fell across his side mirror, Carter steeled himself for what was coming, his mind already running through protocols and procedures he taught countless times at the Bureau's training sessions. This wasn't just going to be another traffic stop. Deep down, both men could feel it. The air was charged with tension as Officer Wilson's knuckles rapped against the tinted window, setting in motion events that would ripple through their entire community and force everyone to confront the uncomfortable reality of bias in law enforcement. The window hummed quietly as it rolled down, revealing the interior of the Range Rover. Officer Wilson's flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, sweeping across the pristine leather interior before settling on Special Agent Carter's face. The FBI agent remained perfectly still, his hands visible on the steering wheel, his expression neutral despite the tension crackling in the air. "License and registration," Wilson barked, his voice carrying an edge that seemed unnecessary for a routine traffic stop. His flashlight beam remained fixed on Carter's face, the light unnecessarily bright and unwavering. "Good evening, officer," Carter replied, his voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" He maintained eye contact through the glare of the flashlight, years of law enforcement experience evident in his composed demeanor. Wilson's jaw tightened. I said, "License and registration. We can discuss the reason after you comply with my request." His free hand remained near his holster, a detail that didn't escape Carter's notice. "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my breast pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's all right." Carter narrated his movements clearly, a practice he taught countless times in FBI training sessions. He waited for Wilson's terse nod before moving. As Carter slowly reached for his pocket, Wilson tensed visibly. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he snapped, despite Carter's careful movements and clear communication. "Sir, you asked for my license. I'm simply reaching for my wallet as requested," Carter explained patiently, his voice remaining calm despite the officer's increasingly aggressive tone. The situation was deteriorating, and he could feel it. A couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk slowed down, watching the scene unfold with concern. The neighborhood was usually quiet at this hour, and the tension in the air was palpable even to passers-by. "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson demanded suddenly, his hand now fully resting on his holster. The order came without warning or explanation, catching even the onlookers off guard. Carter took a deep breath, knowing this moment was crucial. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong, and you haven't given me a reason for this stop. I'm happy to comply with reasonable requests, but I'd like to understand why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle." Wilson's face hardened. "I don't have to explain myself. Exit the vehicle now." His voice rose, echoing down the peaceful suburban street. The couple with the dog had stopped completely now, the woman pulling out her phone and beginning to record. Carter glanced at his own phone, still recording on the passenger seat, then at his FBI credentials in his breast pocket. He knew what would happen next could go one of two ways. His years of experience told him this officer was looking for confrontation, not cooperation. "Sir," Carter tried one more time, his voice clear and professional, "I'm a federal law enforcement officer. If you'll allow me to show you my credentials." "Out of the vehicle!" Wilson's voice thundered through the evening air, his flashlight beam shaking with barely contained anger. More neighbors were appearing on their porches now, drawn by the commotion. Carter realized that de-escalation wasn't going to work here. Sometimes the only way through a situation was forward. With deliberate movements, he reached for his door handle, knowing that the next few minutes would change lives forever. The streetlights had fully come on now, casting long shadows across the scene. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of children being called in for dinner, a stark contrast to the tension unfolding on this quiet suburban street. As Carter began to open his door, he caught his reflection in the side mirror, a respected FBI agent with decades of service about to be humiliated on his own street, in his own neighborhood. But there was something else in that reflection too: determination. This moment, as uncomfortable as it was, could become a catalyst for change. Wilson backed up slightly, his hand still on his weapon, as Carter slowly emerged from the vehicle. The FBI agent stood tall, his movements measured and non-threatening, yet dignified. He was no stranger to difficult situations, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced prejudice behind a badge. The evening air grew heavier with each passing second, the tension building like a thunderstorm about to break. Neither man knew it yet, but their lives were about to change forever, their confrontation becoming a turning point that would echo through their department and community for years to come. The cool evening air wrapped around them as Special Agent Carter stood beside his Range Rover, his hands raised slightly to show he posed no threat. The growing crowd of neighbors watched in stunned silence as Officer Wilson circled him like a predator, flashlight beam dancing across Carter's expensive suit. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Wilson commanded, pulling his handcuffs free with a metallic click that seemed to echo down the quiet street. A child's basketball bounced forgotten on a nearby driveway, rolling to a stop as its young owner stared at the scene unfolding before him. "Officer," Carter spoke calmly, his voice carrying the weight of his years of experience, "I want to cooperate, but this is a mistake. If you'll just allow me to show you my credentials." I said, "Turn around." Wilson's voice cracked like a whip through the evening air. More phones had appeared in windows and on porches, their cameras capturing every moment of this increasingly tense situation. Carter slowly turned around, his movements deliberate and dignified. He could have resisted. His FBI training had taught him a dozen ways to handle this situation differently. But he understood something deeper was at play here. Sometimes the best way to expose a broken system was to let it break itself. The handcuffs were coiled against his wrists as Wilson roughly secured them, tighter than necessary. Carter winced but remained silent. Through the growing crowd, he spotted Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down, a hand covering her mouth in shock. Next to her, the Robinson kids had stopped their bike ride home, watching with wide eyes as someone they'd seen at neighborhood barbecues was being treated like a criminal. "You're making a serious mistake," Carter said quietly, maintaining his composure even as Wilson roughly patted him down. "I'm a federal agent. My credentials are in my breast pocket and my badge." "Save it for the station," Wilson snapped, though something in his voice had changed. Perhaps it was the growing crowd of witnesses, or maybe it was the obvious sophistication of the man he was arresting, but a hint of uncertainty had crept into his tone. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the peaceful suburban street in flashing reds and blues. The younger officers who stepped out took in the scene with obvious discomfort. They knew Wilson's reputation, and something about this situation felt wrong from the start. "What's the charge?" Carter asked clearly, making sure his voice carried to the recording phones around them. "I'd like to know why I'm being arrested." A teenager on his porch mouthed, "This isn't right," to his mother, who nodded grimly as she continued recording. Wilson hesitated for a split second before answering, resisting arrest and failure to comply with an officer's commands. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, but he was too far committed to back down now. As the younger officers approached, Carter noticed their uncomfortable glances at each other. One of them, Officer Thompson, seemed to recognize something familiar about him. Carter had given a lecture at the police academy just last month about interagency cooperation. He could see the wheels turning in Thompson's mind. "Sir," Thompson began cautiously, addressing Wilson, "maybe we should." "Get him in the car," Wilson cut him off, but his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. The situation was shifting, like a tide slowly turning, though Wilson seemed to be the only one who couldn't feel it. As they led him toward the patrol car, Carter caught his reflection in his Range Rover's window. His suit was wrinkled now, his tie slightly askew, but his expression remained composed. He knew his phone was still recording inside the vehicle, capturing every word, every action. His dashboard camera had caught the entire stop. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to fight injustice was to let it expose itself. The neighbors watched in collective disbelief as Carter was placed in the back of the patrol car. Mrs. Chen was already on her phone, likely calling the local news. The Robinson kids had rushed home to tell their father, a city council member, what they'd witnessed. The wheels of justice were already turning, though not in the way Officer Wilson had intended. Inside the patrol car, Carter sat straight and tall, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. He could see Wilson arguing with the other officers outside, their body language showing growing concern. Through the window, he noticed more neighbors arriving, phones out, voices raised in protest. This quiet suburban street had become an unexpected battlefield in a much larger war against prejudice and abuse of power. The young officer Thompson kept glancing back at him through the rearview mirror, recognition and worry fighting across his face. Carter gave him a small, knowing nod. Soon, very soon, everyone would understand exactly what kind of mistake had been made here. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Carter counted at least 20 witnesses, most with phones raised, documenting everything. The truth would come out, not through anger or violence, but through the patient exposure of injustice. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice was simply letting it play out in front of the right audience. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the police station as Officer Wilson strutted through the booking area, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd just finished patting himself on the back for what he thought was another successful arrest. The booking officer looked up from his computer, his expression neutral as he watched Wilson lead the well-dressed man in handcuffs toward the processing desk. "Got a live one here," Wilson announced, his voice carrying across the room. A few other officers glanced up briefly before returning to their paperwork, used to Wilson's theatrical arrests by now. But something felt different about this one. The arrestee carried himself with unusual confidence for someone in cuffs. The booking officer began the routine process, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Name?" he asked, looking at Carter with professional detachment. Before Carter could answer, the station phone rang. The booking officer picked it up with his usual bored expression, but within seconds his face changed. His eyes widened, darting between Wilson and Carter as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's right here. No, sir, booking hasn't been completed. Yes, sir, I understand completely." The booking officer's voice had taken on a new tone, one of barely concealed alarm. Wilson noticed the change. "What's going on?" he demanded, but the slight tremor in his voice suggested he already sensed something was very wrong. The booking officer slowly placed the phone down, his face pale. "That was the FBI field office," he said quietly. "Their special agent in charge was just arrested in a traffic stop." His eyes fixed on Carter, who stood calmly despite still being handcuffed. "They're sending a team. They'll be here in 5 minutes." The color drained from Wilson's face so quickly he had to grab the edge of the desk for support. Around the room, every officer had stopped what they were doing, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding situation. "Might want to remove these cuffs now," Carter suggested mildly, turning slightly to offer his still-bound wrists. "And I believe my credentials are still in my breast pocket, if you care to verify my identity." The booking officer quickly fumbled with the handcuff keys while Wilson stood frozen, his earlier swagger evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. The click of the handcuffs opening echoed in the now silent room. Carter rolled his shoulders, adjusting his suit jacket with dignity. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his FBI credentials, laying them on the booking desk. The gold badge caught the fluorescent light, seeming to shine accusingly at everyone present. The station doors burst open as several FBI agents strode in, their faces set in professional masks that barely concealed their anger. The lead agent's eyes locked onto Carter immediately. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her concern genuine. When Carter nodded, she turned to address the room at large. Would someone care to explain why the special agent in charge of the local FBI field office was arrested during a routine traffic stop? The silence in the room was deafening. Wilson had backed up against the wall, his face a mix of shock and dawning horror as the full implications of his actions began to sink in. The other officers in the room either stared at their desks or looked at Wilson with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. The police chief burst out of his office, having just received the call about the situation. His face was red with a combination of embarrassment and anger. He took one look at Carter, then at Wilson, and his expression darkened further. "Officer Wilson, my office. Now." The chief's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of impending consequences. Wilson shuffled toward the office, his earlier confidence replaced by the demeanor of a scolded child. Carter watched the scene unfold with composed dignity. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, but perhaps it was necessary. Sometimes it took a dramatic event to spark real change. As the chief's door closed behind Wilson, the booking officer began frantically shredding the half-completed paperwork as if trying to erase all evidence of their mistake. But everyone knew this incident wouldn't be so easily forgotten. Already, phones were ringing throughout the station as news of the incident spread. The other officers in the room were looking at Carter with new eyes now, not just as an FBI agent, but as someone who had maintained his composure and dignity in the face of blatant prejudice. A few seemed to be reflecting on their own past behaviors, perhaps wondering how many times they had made similar assumptions. One young officer approached Carter, his face showing genuine remorse. "Sir, we're not all like that. I hope you know that." Carter nodded, straightening his tie. "I know," he replied quietly. "That's why what happens next is so important. This isn't about punishment, it's about growth and change." The following week unfolded like a whirlwind at the police department. The Internal Affairs Office had been transformed into a hub of intense activity. Stacks of files covered every available surface, and investigators moved with purpose between desks, piecing together a story that grew more troubling with each passing day. In a dimly lit review room, 3 investigators sat watching the dashboard camera footage from Carter's Range Rover. The crystal-clear video showed every moment of the traffic stop, leaving no doubt about Wilson's conduct. One investigator shook his head in disbelief as he made notes on his tablet. "Play that body cam footage again," the lead investigator requested, leaning forward in his chair. The wall-mounted screen flickered to life with footage from Wilson's own camera, providing yet another angle of the incident. The audio was particularly deafening, every unnecessary command, every aggressive tone, captured in perfect clarity. Down the hall, another team was going through Wilson's past arrest records. What they found painted a disturbing pattern. One investigator stood up suddenly, waving a file. "Look at this," she called to her colleagues. "Last month, 3 traffic stops, all minorities, all without probable cause. No charges filed in any of them." The investigation wasn't limited to the station walls. Around the neighborhood where the arrest had taken place, investigators interviewed witnesses one by one. Mrs. Chen from the corner house shared her cell phone video, which had already gone viral on social media. The Robinson kid's father, the city council member, provided a written statement about what his children had witnessed. Back at the station, the police chief sat in his office, blinds drawn, reviewing complaint forms that had been filed against Wilson over the past 3 years. Each one had been dismissed or buried in paperwork. The chief's hand trembled slightly as he signed the paperwork authorizing a full review of the department's complaint investigation procedures. "How did we miss this?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. On his desk lay a preliminary report about Wilson's arrest record. The statistics were impossible to ignore. The racial disparity in his traffic stops and arrests was glaring. In another room, 2 officers from the technical unit were reviewing Wilson's work emails and communications. They found messages that made them uncomfortable, casual jokes and comments that revealed a pattern of bias they'd all become too accustomed to overlooking. The department's training officer sat in on the investigation meetings, taking detailed notes. It was clear that changes would need to be made to their training programs. The incident with Carter had exposed gaps in their bias recognition training that could no longer be ignored. Throughout the week, Carter himself came in several times to provide statements and review evidence. Each time he walked through the station, officers watched him with a mixture of respect and shame. He was a man who had every right to be angry, to demand harsh punishment, but instead carried himself with dignity and spoke of necessary change. The neighborhood wasn't quiet either. Community meetings were hastily organized, with residents sharing their own experiences. The incident had opened a floodgate of similar stories, times when they'd felt targeted but hadn't known how to speak up. At the end of the week, the evidence room was filled with investigators presenting their findings. Videos played on multiple screens, the dashcam footage, body camera recordings, witness videos from phones. Documents covered the tables, arrest records, complaint forms, email printouts. The story they told was undeniable. The lead investigator stood before the group, her voice firm as she summarized their findings. "This isn't just about one traffic stop," she explained. "What we're seeing is a systemic issue that's been building for years. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" In the back of the room, Carter listened quietly. He'd been invited to these proceedings not as a victim, but as a law enforcement professional whose insight would be valuable in addressing these issues. His presence served as a constant reminder of the real human impact of biased policing. Outside the station, news vans had become a regular sight. The story had captured national attention, not just because of what happened, but because of how it was being handled. This wasn't going to be another case of a quick suspension and empty promises. Real change was coming, and everyone could feel it. As the sun set on the final day of the initial investigation, the team gathered their findings into a comprehensive report. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable, and the need for change obvious. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward reform. The hearing room was packed on the morning of the disciplinary board meeting. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Officer Wilson sat at one table, his uniform pressed, but his shoulders slumped. His eyes kept darting to the door, knowing Special Agent Carter would soon walk through it. The room buzzed with whispered conversations. Department heads, senior officers, and civil rights representatives filled the seats. Local news reporters sat in the back with their notepads ready, knowing this hearing would be different from the usual disciplinary proceedings. When Carter entered, the room fell silent. He moved with quiet confidence to his seat, nodding respectfully to the board members. The contrast between the two men was striking. Wilson seemed to shrink in his chair, while Carter's presence filled the room without him saying a word. The board chairperson, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair, cleared her throat. "This hearing is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "We're here to address the events of 2 weeks ago and their broader implications for our department." As the evidence was presented, videos played on large screens mounted on the walls. The footage was even more impactful in the formal setting, every biased action, every unnecessary command echoing through the room. Wilson watched himself on screen, his face growing paler with each passing minute. Then came the statistics. Charts and graphs displayed Wilson's traffic stop history, showing clear patterns that could no longer be explained away. The room grew tenser as each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of systemic bias. When it was Carter's turn to speak, he stood slowly. Everyone expected anger, demands for harsh punishment. Instead, his words surprised them all. "I'm not here for revenge," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm here because we have an opportunity to turn a mistake into a moment of real change." He paused, looking directly at Wilson. Officer Wilson's actions were wrong, but they're symptoms of a larger problem. A problem we can fix if we're willing to do the hard work. Wilson looked up, meeting Carter's gaze for the first time. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the defensive wall he built around himself. Carter continued, laying out a proposal that shocked everyone in the room. Instead of calling for Wilson's termination, he suggested a comprehensive reform program. "Firing one officer doesn't solve the underlying issues," he explained. "But using this incident as a catalyst for department-wide change, that could make a real difference." He outlined a plan for enhanced bias training, community engagement programs, and regular review of traffic stop data. Wilson would be required to participate in all of these programs, working directly with community members he'd previously treated with suspicion. The board members exchanged glances. This wasn't the usual punishment-focused hearing they were used to. This was something new, something that could actually create lasting change. Wilson was called to speak next. His hands shook as he gripped the podium. I've had a lot of time to think," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Watching those videos, seeing myself through others' eyes," he paused, taking a deep breath. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced. But the evidence is right there. I can't deny it anymore." The room remained silent as Wilson continued, his voice growing stronger. "Agent Carter has every right to demand my badge. Instead, he's offering a chance to be part of the solution. I don't deserve that chance, but I want to take it. I want to do better." As the hearing continued, the sunlight shifted across the room. What had started as a disciplinary proceeding had transformed into something more meaningful, a blueprint for real change. In the heart of Boston's bustling streets, Officer James Miller sat in his patrol car, scanning his district with the practiced eye of a 15-year veteran. His chest swelled with pride whenever he thought about his impressive arrest record, though he never stopped to examine the patterns in his policing. On this crisp autumn morning, he was patrolling through Beacon Hill, an upscale neighborhood where old money met modern luxury. Through his windshield, Miller spotted a black Mercedes parked across from a Victorian mansion. Inside sat a well-dressed black man, seemingly observing the property. Miller's jaw tightened, his prejudices immediately clouding his judgment. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, despite having no valid reason for suspicion beyond his own biases. The tension in the air was palpable as Miller approached the Mercedes, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. The man inside remained perfectly still, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Miller's aggressive stance. "Step out of the vehicle," Miller barked, not even waiting for an explanation. The man tried to speak, reaching slowly for what appeared to be identification, but Miller's prejudices had already written the script. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Miller's voice echoed down the quiet street. The man complied, his composed expression never wavering as he explained he was conducting surveillance. Miller scoffed, already reaching for his handcuffs. 2 other patrol cars arrived, their officers watching uncomfortably as their colleague made what was clearly a questionable arrest. The station buzzed with its usual morning activity when Miller proudly marched in with his suspect. The booking officer began the standard procedure, but everything changed when he ran the man's credentials. The room fell silent. Standing before them was the lead agent of an FBI task force conducting a legitimate investigation into a series of sophisticated burglaries plaguing Boston's wealthy neighborhoods. Miller's world spun as his chief marched down the hallway, face red with anger and embarrassment. The FBI agent maintained his professional demeanor, even as high-ranking officials from both departments scrambled to contain the situation. Miller's body camera footage told a damning story, one of assumptions, prejudice, and abuse of power. Word spread quickly through law enforcement circles, and soon local news vans gathered outside the station. Miller's previous arrests came under intense scrutiny, revealing a disturbing pattern that could no longer be ignored. The FBI agent, rather than pursuing legal action, saw an opportunity for meaningful change. Internal Affairs launched a thorough investigation, and Miller was suspended. The department faced public pressure to address its systemic issues. The FBI agent worked with police leadership to develop comprehensive bias training programs and new accountability measures. Miller spent his suspension reflecting on his actions, forced to confront the ugly truth about his prejudices. Community meetings were held, where residents shared their experiences with law enforcement. The FBI agent's case became a turning point, leading to the implementation of new protocols for officer training and community engagement. Miller attended these sessions, initially resistant but gradually opening his eyes to the impact of his actions. The story reached its peak 6 months later at a public forum on police reform. Miller, humbled by his experience, shared his journey from pride to prejudice to understanding. The room fell silent as he described how his biases had nearly destroyed his career and, more importantly, how they had hurt countless citizens he'd sworn to protect. The FBI agent's approach to the incident created lasting change. The department instituted regular community feedback sessions, revamped its training programs, and established an independent review board for citizen complaints. Crime rates actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement grew stronger. Years later, new officers would learn about this incident during their training. Miller became an advocate for change, speaking at police academies about the dangers of unchecked bias. The FBI agent's professional handling of the situation was credited with transforming a potentially explosive confrontation into an opportunity for growth and reform. The story served as a powerful reminder that true justice requires constant vigilance against our own prejudices. In Boston, it became known as the day when one officer's mistake led to a department's transformation. The changes implemented reached far beyond a single incident, touching lives throughout the community and setting a new standard for police accountability. Statistics showed impressive improvements in police-community relations following the reforms. Complaint rates dropped significantly, and minority communities reported feeling safer and more respected during police interactions. What began as a tense confrontation on a quiet street became a catalyst for lasting change in law enforcement culture. The FBI agent occasionally returned to speak at department events, his presence a reminder of both past mistakes and future possibilities. Miller's journey from defiant defender of the status quo to champion of reform inspired others to examine their own biases. Together, they proved that meaningful change was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward solutions. This story continues to resonate because it highlights how a single incident, handled with wisdom and grace, can transform not just individuals but entire institutions. It reminds us that true strength lies not in maintaining power, but in admitting mistakes and working to correct them. The lessons learned that day in Boston echo through police departments nationwide, proving that change begins with the courage to face our own prejudices.